Richard, welcome back to the podcast. Great to have you.
Yeah, glad to be here, Erik. Thanks.
So the last time we chatted about your book, The Origins of Woke, around February, I'm curious if you're working on a new book, or if you were working on a new book, what topic would it be about? And that's mostly a way to ask, what are the big ideas you've been thinking about recently, or that you've been proud of and think add value to the discourse?
Well, Erik, I'll break some news here.
Excellent.
And I'll tell you that I'm thinking about writing a book on the concept of elite human capital, because it's a topic that has drawn me in. It is something that I keep talking about and I keep seeing. And when that happens, I usually, the 2 books I've written, it's because I just wanted to get everything that I have to say about a topic out of my system. And then I get sort of bored with it. Like, I'm very bored with woke. Like, I can't even read anything about it anymore because I got it out of my system. I had a bunch of stuff to say and now I've moved on. And so elite human capital is I just keep coming back to this idea that there is basically this kind of natural elite that tends to rule in modern developed societies, and understanding this type of person, not just in ideological terms, but like things that people don't think of as ideological, like their approach to truth and their approach to knowledge and how they see themselves in relation to the rest of society. I think that's an important and powerful idea. So I'm going to probably get that EHC, you just sort of scratch that itch, get that all out of my system, and then hopefully move on to something else.
And is the elite human capital idea similar to Jonathan Rauch's sort of idea of the reality-based community, or when we unpack what is EHC here and what makes it different?
Yeah. So, I mean, elite human capital is basically people who are smart, but it's not really, IQ is not the only distinguishing factor. It's part of it. There's a correlation between IQ and elite human capital. It's the people that are unusually idealistic. So these are the people who go into fields like journalism, they go into fields like academia, they go into nonprofits. They're interested in ideas. They're interested in changing the world. And sometimes people will disparage them and say, oh, these are like trust fund kids or whatever. In some cases, yeah. But in other cases, I know a lot of people who are journalists, who are aspiring academics, who could have made a lot more money doing something else, and they didn't come from the richest background. So that's not accurate. And so these are people who care about truth. They tend towards certain ideological positions. It doesn't have to be liberal in the current American sense, but they do trend towards either leftist or classical liberal or libertarian. What you don't find them is like blood and soil nationalists. That's very rare. There are maybe exceptions to this, maybe under wartime or something in Ukraine or something. These are these exceptions that I sort of have to think about. But I'm talking about developed societies, and basically, they have tension and they have a sort of identity that is distinguished from the rest of society, and they tend towards cosmopolitanism. I mean, this is you go back in history. I mean, you go back to European royalty. The Russian rulers, the Russian aristocrats sometimes speak French, sometimes don't even speak the language of the people that they live with. So it's very common, they intermarry. It's very common for elites to have this sort of cosmopolitan attitude. We see it continues today. Now it's more merit-based rather than hereditary or aristocracy. And that introduces all of these kind of complications and these subtleties, in the differences between the past and the present. At the same time, and it's also becoming more important, I think, because it's strongly correlated with politics. Maybe 15, 20 years ago, elite human capital would be found across both political parties in America. And this, what I say about America is somewhat true for much of the rest of the world. Now, elite human capital basically concentrates on the left side of the political spectrum. Even if they don't agree on everything, there tends to be a human capital difference between people who support Trump and people who find Trump offensive. And so, yeah, this is the idea. I have a few Substacks on it. I'm going to bring those Substacks together. I'm going to refine the idea a little bit and maybe write a book. I'm not 100% sure, actually, I'm going to do this. I'm probably going to do it. But if I write a book soon, it's going to be that.
Love it. Let's dive in a little bit. Nassim Taleb has this idea of kind of intellectuals yet idiots, right? Mark Andreessen likes to point out that, World War II, a lot of intellectuals were communists or communist sympathetic. I'm curious if you were to, think about the track record of who you would put in as elite human capital over the last decade, on various different topics. I'm curious if you would think, they had a good outcome. It's almost become a parody of trust the experts. But my guess is you actually think non-ironically, we should trust the experts. Maybe they've been more right than we give them credit for, or we need better experts or whatever. But I guess how do you respond to this?
Yeah, I mean, people always have this bias where they sort of remember when elites got things wrong and they don't remember when elites got things right, right? So, you go back to communism, you go back to the mid 20th century, but European integration after the Second World War, that was an elite human capital project. They were right. I mean, the common market was a good idea. They kept the peace in Europe for 70 years. I think America with the rules-based international order after 1945 has been a remarkable success. Again, peace and prosperity, but this time on a global scale, eventually defeated communism. I think that the masses haven't wanted free trade, but I think free trade has been correct. And I think that that's something that's just been an elite project. This extension of the European common European project can be part of that. Women's rights, gay rights, a lot of these things, these cosmopolitan ideas, I think they've generally been correct about a lot of things. Now, elite human capital does not mean that they're always right. They're often wrong. Communism was more of an elite human capital phenomenon, right? It's not that they're right; it's that they're idealistic and they're smart and they're interested in ideas. That can go in bad directions. I think that the point is not whether elite human capital is necessarily good or bad, although that is important and worth considering. The idea is that their rule, some kind of elite human capital rule, is inevitable in the kind of, if you want a civilized society. Now, I think like in the Taliban, case of the Taliban, like the xenophobes and the misogynists, are in power and they can shut down everyone else. In North Korea, I don't think the leadership elite in North Korea is necessarily elite human capital. It's a third generation dictatorship with probably a bunch of yes men and toadies circling around the leader. But any kind of society we would want to live in, it's going to be ruled by elite human capital, and understanding what elite human capital is and how to sort of influence. Understanding it as part of the project is influencing it in a positive direction, because you don't want them to be communist. You want to sort of, present a vision of the world that is true, and that is a framework where, you have an accurate model, an accurate representation of different groups. And then you could hopefully, influence elite human capital to be better, so they won't be communists in future generations.
Why is it inevitable that society will be run by elite human capital? A good society will be run by elite human capital, and what is the way to, or what are examples of ways that they've been influenced in positive direction?
Yeah. So, it ends up this way because there tends to be a trade-off between earning potential and influence in the world, right? If something is people want influence. So money and influence are sort of, you trade off for them in the market. So that's why journalism is not the best paid profession. Government is usually not the best paid profession. You go and you open up a bunch of car dealerships, you can get very wealthy. A remarkable portion of millionaires in America are guys who own car dealership. It's funny because they have some kind of protectionist thing where I don't know. I don't remember all the details, but basically owning a car dealership is a good way to get rich. It's not a good way to be influential or, shape the culture or influence policy, except maybe on lobbying on issues related to car dealerships. But you get the idea. And so, yeah, so like you have these institutions, and a lot of them, I don't know if they would necessarily pop up from scratch, but they're to a large extent, they're legacy institutions. So the universities, right? If Harvard and Yale and Columbia all were destroyed, I don't know if they would necessarily pop up in their current form. If the NBC and New York Times, I don't know if we'd get a new New York Times, right? But these are sort of brand established names. There's a kind of path dependency in them, and because they have these norms, they're attractive to people who are competent and care about truth. Now, a lot of your audience are going to be rightists, and they're going to hate the Academy. They're going to hate the New York Times. But look, I want to know what's going on in Sudan, or I want to know, what's the state of debate in some scientific field. New York Times is not, perfect. They're going to often get things very wrong. But compared to, say, going on Twitter, and especially Twitter recently, and seeing what the kind of stuff that goes viral, the New York Times and NBC are, infinitely superior to most, or you compare it to like the norm throughout human history. People just hear things through word of mouth or through biased actors, a hype man for a company who's going to say he solved he solved aging, or he solved, cured cancer or whatever. That's the alternative to having something like the MSM, right? Just people just with either biased perspective or just people spreading rumors or people, causing trouble or lying for whatever reason. And so, yeah, the fact that you have these institutions and, they're models, other countries tend to develop similar institutions, right? And, it's necessary to have like a functioning society. Like you need government that is at least somewhat neutral. You need ways to innovate and to develop scientific understanding and just to understand the world. And so a lot of people in government who are collecting the economic statistics, the people in academia and science and biology who are doing the research and making these incremental improvements that is modern medicine. These are things that basically these are institutions that are going to attract elite human capital. And you can have a society that doesn't have that doesn't have media institutions that anyone can trust, that doesn't have academic institutions or like research institutions that do all that much. That's usually not going to be a very nice place to live.
Right. And I think if I understand correctly, the blogger Spandrel, his theory around sort of why these people who go into these fields are, predominantly leftist is because the left has, more of an idealistic streak to it, more of a clear path to change things, and more of a path to change things that benefit the people who are in fact changing. If the right is conservatism by nature of conserving, there's less opportunity for change, and that's less opportunity for status acquisition. And so the left has a more sort of liquid status market that if you advocate for leftist interests, you also advocate for your own interests in trying to gain status in this kind of way. Does any of that resonate with you, or why are they always leftist?
Yeah, so I don't think they're always leftists. I mean, I think that during FDR's time, I think that was kind of the masses rising up against a more sort of classically liberal, in our terms, more conservative elite. And you have to ask, what are these sort of, how do they understand interests? Because interests are not just material. Status is not sort of unidimensional, right? And so if someone thinks that your typical journalist, say, journalist, maybe not making that much money for New Yorker or something, or some kind of assistant professor. If you think they would be happy if they could acquire status, if they could like run a local car dealership, I'm just going to use that example because we're already on it, and they can make 3 times as much money, they can have status in their community. I mean, they can move out to small town Ohio and, marry a wife, and the people who know them will think they're, the biggest thing in the world. If you think that they would take that, or like they're just going into journalism or academia because they're incapable of, maybe they are incapable of doing that, but not because like they're not smart enough to run a car dealership or something like that. It's more along the lines of like, they have this inherent value system that is not just focused on, I have a bigger house than you, I have a bigger car than you, I have more money than you. I mean, something like that works for Donald Trump, and Trump's fans like that status sort of hierarchy, maybe because they're not elite human capital, they're the opposite. And he's the person who sort of reflects their values to the greatest extent imaginable, just has gold toilets and helicopters and supermodel wives and so forth. But yeah, I think that these are different values. Just to say interests, and they're trying to push for their own interests by changing the value system. There's probably some of that, but I think the value system is sort of, it sort of comes first. Like they can't, like they couldn't do the other thing. But it's not like, an intelligence thing or something like that. It's the value thing. There is a need for something more. There is a kind of need for meaning in a lot of people that other people don't have. Some people just want to drink beer and maybe bet on sports and barbecue, and that's fine. And I don't. It's not like they always have the highest status, right? It's not like just some guy who's just like a conservative, like instinctually conservative guy who likes, the Green Bay Packers and Donald Trump. Not like he's content with society because he necessarily has the highest status. He might be a loser. But this is the status hierarchy. This is the only thing he can sort of get his head around. It might be an intelligence thing, but it's also an idealistic thing. And so, yeah, I think that talking about groups pushing their own interest, I mean, there's good reasons in Manker Olson, his theory of groups, that usually there's a collective action problem when you start talking about large groups pushing their own interests. So I tend to emphasize values.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Hi, it's Erik. If you're looking to take a deeper dive into international affairs and business strategies, then I highly recommend listening to the new podcast, Dealcraft, Insights from Great Negotiators. Recently called a best podcast pick by The Guardian, Dealcraft features interviews with the world's greatest dealmakers and diplomats, including former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, Blackstone's Steve Schwarzman, and music industry super lawyer John Branca on their most challenging negotiations. Each episode, host Jim Sebenius, Harvard Business School professor and renowned negotiation expert, shares fascinating deal stories and distills useful insights for listeners to apply in their toughest deals and disputes. New episodes release weekly and explore everything from former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's negotiations with Vladimir Putin to how Costa Rican diplomat Christiana Figueres saved the Paris climate talks. So don't miss out. Follow Dealcraft, insights from great negotiators on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Hey everyone, Erik here. In this environment, founders need to become profitable faster and do more with smaller teams, especially when it comes to engineering. That's why Sean Lenihan started Squad, a specialized global talent firm for top engineers that will seamlessly integrate with your org. Squad offers rigorously vetted top 1% talent that will actually work hard for you every day. Their engineers work in your time zone, follow your processes, and use your tools. Squad has front-end engineers excelling in TypeScript and React and Next.js, ready to onboard to your team today. For backend, Squad engineers are experts at Node.js, Python, Java, and a range of other languages and frameworks. While it may cost more than the freelancer on Upwork billing you for 40 hours, but working only 2, Squad offers premium quality at a fraction of the typical cost, without the headache of assessing for skills and culture fit. Squad takes care of sourcing, legal compliance, and local HR for global talent. Increase your velocity without amping up burn. Visit choosesquad.com and mention Turpentine to skip the waitlist.
I'm curious to think about the values, between the differences between someone like Ezra Klein or, a Matt Iglesias on one hand and someone like Elon Musk on the other hand. And maybe, Elon is a often quote tweeter of Cat Turd, an account that you show little, sympathy for. and maybe even to start, we can trace your evolution of how you became someone who originally, to quote your old post, I hate pronoun people more than genocide, to now actually don't really mind about pronoun people, but can't stand cat turd.
I hate cat turd. Yeah. I hate cat turd more than genocide. Yes. I don't, I used to be on the side of we talked about my Tech Right article a while ago. And I used to be, I think probably a lot of your listeners are, of that orientation. And maybe they read my article at the time. And, I still hold on to a lot of the views. My values haven't changed. I've sort of been mugged by reality. Yeah. It was sort of like you have a revolution and then the world changes and then you're like, oh, wait, the revolution had all kinds of problems. So social media, under Elon Musk, I wrote an article one time where I said, Elon Musk just buys Twitter. Our Caesar came along and solved the problem. Great. It's good for me personally. If I was just about my own interest, Elon Musk, follows me and retweets me sometimes and I get more engagement and I don't worry about getting banned from Twitter anymore like I used to. But the free speech issue was solved. And now it's, my God, these all the disinformation people, I thought they were crazy. I thought like we just need free speech, but we have free speech. And now you have 6-figure and 7-figure accounts who do nothing but make stuff up, who just literally not like twist the news, not just biased, but literally breaking sources within the Kamala campaign. Oh, she's about to commit suicide because her internal polls, she's down by 10. It's just this freaking stupid. And this is what the market wants. Candace Owens, I think has, is it 4 million, 5 million? It's in some kind of 5-6 million. I don't know what it is. I looked at recently the top podcasts in the country. They were Tucker, they were Rogan, and they were Candace Owens. Right. And I think those were the top 3, or there might have been one more that was also very, very bad, but they fluctuate day to day. Right. But this is the audience. This is what people want in the podcast space. You see Alex Jones come back. You see Alex Jones sort of become like mainstream within the Republican Party. And it's like, this is human nature. This is human nature. This is what, like, if you put a bunch of third worlders and gave them Twitter and made it uncensored, and like you went to the Middle East or something, or you went to some sub-Saharan African country, this is what it would be like. People making stuff up, conspiracy theories, just crude racism, nobody knowing, like, any caring what's true or knowing what's going on. And that's conservatives. That is conservatives' space. Give conservatives an unrestrained space where they talk to one another. This is what they end up with. And you have to think about that. And you have to think about the fact that they've never built, I'm an intellectual. Like, people are like, oh, you turn on the right. It's hard to be a right-wing intellectual because, like, I want to read about the world. Like, I want to read a story about the civil war in Burma. I keep bringing this example of the civil war in Burma because, like, there is a world of conservatives. I literally don't know Burma exists. Like, I probably would have trouble finding like the population. I probably, wouldn't even have statistics on, much less like a map of like what's going on in the civil war right now and like which group is controlling. Not that I'm a Burma, in Myanmar expert or anything, or this is like my biggest interest, but it's just, trying to understand something about the world, right? Wanting something like an intellectual life. They don't have that. Elon, does great things. He gets to Mars, right? He's going to get us to Mars. Hopefully, he builds these reusable rockets. I think Nate Silver's book, talks about the river and the village. And I think these are sort of, it's a little bit broader. He could have done, I think, a more narrow book. And I think what he's really getting at is that basically it's basically the tech right versus the liberal establishment. I think that's probably like a sort of a related idea to what he's talking about. And I'm convinced we need a synthesis. We don't need Elon to crush the New York Times. We don't want New York Times to crush Elon either. We want some kind of synthesis where we take this kind of, spirit that a lot of these right-wing people have, a lot of these people that come out of business, and take what's good out of these institutions, these established institutions. Know that there's no like Alex Jones, or there's no conservative like version of this coming. And somehow that's where we need to be. We need this synthesis.
Going back to the Noah Smith, Ezra Klein, Matt Iglesias view of the world, of course they have differences between them, but sort of the liberal establishment or the best of that, and you take the best of the tech right, Elon, Mark Andreessen, Peter Thiel, David Sachs or whatever. What do you think are the main differences between those what needs to be bridged?
Yeah. And so I can put myself in the shoes of, the tech right people, because I think I was closest to them a couple years ago. And, I think that there's a tendency to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Now, a lot of the discourse we're seeing, we're sitting here and we're a few weeks before the election. So like, I don't, when I see people saying things that are twisting the truth or not necessarily, the fairest characterization of someone's position, I'm a little bit more forgiving because I know it's election season. People get crazy and people think they have an interest in saying things that necessarily aren't, the fairest characterization of their opponents. But, there's a tendency to just sort of take a lot of things for granted that you shouldn't take for granted. Like Iglesias has an article today. So he talks about how Elon Musk at one point, was tweeting about how no way SBF would get charged because he's a Democratic donor. And a lot of the tech right people took this line. SBF was charged. They did not update their worldview, right? And he talks about how Democrats are getting charged under the Biden administration. Biden's son, his own son, nobody on earth believes Donald Trump would ever let his own son get charged with something when he had the position to pardon him. And not a single Trump supporter in the world would say that. The only way they can explain Hunter getting charged is they have to say, well, it's a deep state distraction. I don't know. They have to have some kind of theory, because they can't make an equivalent with Trump, right? So these basic things that when you're mad at leftists, when you see them being woke, when you see them, especially if you're someone like Elon and you're fighting the regulatory state all day, and you moved your company out of California because of all the COVID restrictions, and you see sort of how crazy they are. A lot of people we know, they send their children to San Francisco schools, and God knows what they're teaching in these San Francisco schools to little kids. They put it all together and they say, this is the establishment. These people are wrong. We need to get rid of them, right? And then on the other side of the left, the best of the leftist establishment, I think they just sort of, they see Trump with clear eyes. People say it's Trump derangement syndrome. I don't think it's true. I think if you describe this man objectively, you come across as deranged, because he is what he is. And they sort of see that these things aren't necessarily things we should take for granted, right? These institutional things. Now, I don't, and I think that they, a lot of them are sort of, if you talk to them issue by issue, you might say, well, SpaceX, you might go to them and say, SpaceX wants to do a rocket launch, and Elon was posting the other day that they have to take the SEALs and they have to kidnap the SEALs and see if it bothers them. I think if you showed them that issue in isolation, they would grant you, okay. If you take them and say, oh, they were masking kids in California for 2 years after COVID, they'd probably say, okay, you're right on that. They can see the individual cases where sort of regulation has gone wrong, or kind of the way our government and our system operates. They're not seeing necessarily the big picture that a lot of this stuff is baked in. And the Democratic Party, to a large extent, is captured by some of the worst interest groups out there. I was paying attention to the dock workers, the longshoremen strike a couple weeks ago. And, some people told me on Twitter, like, if we'll use the word Kamala, if she comes out against the longshoremen. And I said, maybe, because this is an interesting test, because you have Kamala saying things that sound more moderate. She says, I'm going to take more input from business leaders, and so forth. Could she challenge a union? Could she challenge an interest group on her own side? No, she came out fully in support of the longshoremen. So did Biden. So, when I go back to 2020, 2021, like, they wouldn't stand up to the teachers unions. I see the same thing. Here. I think they're still sort of enthralled to the worst interest groups. And, a lot of the best of the left will recognize when masking children or, opposing automation at the ports, the longshoremen are just, Luddites. They're just they just don't believe in technological progress. Noah Smith and Ezra Klein and Matthew Glazer, they're not going to support that. But I don't think they understand, like, the people on their side are just, they can have their like little debating club about and their Substacks about what's good policy or not. Unfortunately, on the ground, it's that the worst people in the Democratic Party are often in control.
Yeah. And what do you say to the people on the right who might say something, the smartest of them might say, hey, January 6th was really bad, insanely bad. And Trump is, a wrecking ball of, he's very bad, but this election is about who's worse. And there's something about, the Democrat Party in terms of, if you look at things like the Russia gate or the impeachments or the attempt to putting Trump in jail, or just things that go beyond what Trump himself or the Republican Party has done in terms of subverting some basic, sort of, they're more likely to pack the core. They're more likely to do you sympathize with that, or do you think that's incorrect?
I generally think there's incorrect. Now, there is a pro-Trump argument that I sympathize with, that I even make myself, on some days, depending on how I'm feeling on that day. I might not believe my own argument, but I think it's respectable. It's that Trump is awful, but Democrats are the anti-progress party. They're the people of high taxes, high regulation. They're the extreme safety as an oppressive regulatory state that doesn't let you do great things, that wants to ban prediction markets in most cases, and not the Democratic judge actually just legalized prediction markets, but in most cases, this basically just has this extreme safetyism, this extreme sort of, this worldview that will lead us to being a bureaucratized, stagnant kind of country, right? And so, granted, Trump is bad. Here's all the things Democrats. Ben Shapiro just had a tweet where he said, I don't care about January 6th, whatever. I was in Los Angeles last night and my friend got mugged by a bunch of black guys, and that's what people care. Now, I don't think Trump is like going to do something about black guys mugging Ben Shapiro's friend. I think that we overrate crime as far as an issue in the presidential election. I mean, I don't think it has much influence, but that's the idea, right? It's not now any kind of what I'm not. So I'm sympathetic towards that. What I'm not sympathetic towards is any argument that tries to excuse Trump. Any one thing that tries to make a comparison between Trump literally trying to overthrow the government in 2020 and Democrats impeaching him for trying to overthrow the government. That's the least they could have done, right? Impeaching him. The Ukraine thing.
Yeah.
He's on tape. He's on tape saying he's bribing a foreign leader, saying dig up dirt on my enemy. I don't think this is a close call. When he was on the phone with people who haven't listened to his conversation on the phone with the Secretary of State of Georgia, just listen to it. The second I heard that, I was just done with any kind of apologetics for Trump. The way the conversation goes, you're going to get in trouble. He's like threatening him. He's like threatening, you're going to get in trouble. If, there's fraud, you're going to get in trouble. All I need is you find me 10,000 votes. It's like, what would it take to convince you people that like this guy, like doesn't care about like election fraud? It's not like a good faith attempt to get to the bottom of the election. He just wants it overthrown and doesn't care how he's doing it and is willing to threaten people and use whatever tools he has. So this is very bad. And like, Russiagate, okay, like there were some things that were leaked to the media. There was an investigation. The investigation, didn't find that much. He wasn't charged. It was, there was done through the legal processes. And by the way, I mean, Trump appointed attorney general, they had a special counsel. So there was like, a process to this, some kind of legality, some kind of, logic. And by the way, 2019, I mean, the Democrats don't talk about Russiagate anymore, right? After the Mueller report came out, well, Republicans continue to deny elections. Trump now just still says, if Jesus counted the votes, he told Dr. Phil this, if Jesus counted the votes, I would win California. I mean, this guy is like, doesn't even pretend. He doesn't pretend to believe in democracy. He doesn't pretend to believe he believes in any system other than Trump wins. Right. And like, so it drives me crazy when people try to, it's like, imagine if Kamala Harris went around saying, I won Texas, I won Alabama. You would think she was a mental patient, right? Like he's just so beyond like anything that anyone else is like. So like, okay, you overlook all that. You want to get to Mars. You want Elon in control of the government rather than the Randy Weingart, the lady who runs the biggest teachers union. Like, okay, like that is reasonable. Weaponization, government, Trump, like comparing Trump favorably, like no, I just don't think you could do that. I'd be intellectually honest.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
As a Cognitive Revolution listener, you're obviously interested in cutting-edge AI technology. And with that in mind, I'm proud to say that this episode is brought to you in part by Notion. Notion has been a clear leader in high-value applications of generative AI since the wave began. Earlier this year, we had Notion AI engineer Linus Lee on the podcast. The quality of his insights showcased the caliber of talent that Notion employs. And that inside look at how Notion builds with AI is still extremely valued. Given my personal focus on AI automation recently, I specifically wanted to highlight Notion's library of workflow and automation templates. If you're looking to streamline your processes and lay the foundation for future AI-driven automation, these templates are an excellent starting point. And even if you're not ready for full automation, you'll benefit immediately from Notion AI, Notion's latest all-in-one AI implementation that searches through thousands of documents, regardless of whether they live in Notion or on some other platform like Slack or Google Docs, to deeply understand the context of your work and generate highly relevant analysis and content just for you. Notion is used by more than half of Fortune 500 companies, helping teams reduce emails, meetings, and time spent searching for information. Want to try it? Head to notion.com/cognitive revolution. You can start for free, and using our link supports the show. So join me in giving Notion AI a shot today at notion.com/cognitive revolution.
You like to optimize things. You've chosen the perfect credit card to maximize your travel points, and you always find the fastest route when you drive. Shouldn't you handle your charitable giving the same way? GiveWell spends 50,000 hours every year doing deep dives into different charitable programs to try to find the ways to do the most good for your dollar. GiveWell has now spent over 17 years researching charitable organizations and only directs funding to a few of the highest impact opportunities they've found. Over 100,000 donors have used GiveWell to donate more than $2 billion. Rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 200,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. It's easy to see why the Boston Globe called GiveWell the gold standard for giving. GiveWell wants as many donors as possible to make informed decisions about high-impact giving. You can find all of their research and recommendations on their site for free. You can make tax-deductible donations to their recommended funds or charities, and GiveWell doesn't take a cut. Go to givewell.org to find out more or make a donation. Select podcast and enter Econ102 at checkout to make sure they know you heard about them from us. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or find out more.
If you had a few hours with Elon or kind of the broader tech right that I mentioned before, and you were trying to persuade them to come to a little bit closer to your side on some of these broader, but most important topics, how might you try to persuade them? What arguments do you think they might be sympathetic towards?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think that in the case of Elon, I think a lot of these guys see themselves as I think it would be very hard because I think a lot of them see Trump now as a vessel for their own power. And to convince them, well, maybe you shouldn't have absolute power in society is probably like a hard thing to sell someone like Elon Musk on. And so, it's difficult. I don't know. Like, I don't know how to like frame it in a way that like is especially geared towards that audience if you have sort of a personal stake in the outcome of all this. I would say that like, maybe I would try something like, okay, like take the value system a lot of the tech right people have. You want stable societies, you need the sort of underlying societal stability in order to do life extension or go to Mars or whatever the things you happen to be dreaming about. And I just would point out like how historically rare an institution that is as good as the New York Times is. Like, just frankly, like, there's something as good as the New York Times. Like, you don't have that in the developing world. You don't have the conservative media. Like, I would keep pointing out like how bad. Now, a lot of these guys are retweeting cat turd, so maybe they think that's like actually a great source of information and better than the New York Times. And if they're that far gone, I don't really know what to do. But I would stress this: like, you guys care about civilization. It's the precondition for the other things you care about. See what our society has gotten right, and like fight these leftists in situations where you need to. But don't just, don't give in to nihilism. Don't give in to nihilism or the idea that like Trump should just vegetate in front of the TV for 4 years and you should just run the government and that's all we need to fix the world.
Is it fair to say that over the past few years or so, the elite human capital view towards crime was, closer to things like defund the police, or closer to things like, hey, crime is complicated and we need therapists, and, poverty is sort of multifactorial approach to solving it. Whereas the sort of common sense view is the Bukele view of, hey, just put criminals in jail and have very strong threats. And like, do you think that is a fair categorization of crime specifically versus the intellectual view versus sort of the common sense view? And do you think lots of issues are kind of like that, where there's this like intellectual view that's kind of like divorced from how things actually work right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a good demonstration of a situation where elite human capital isn't always correct. I can't deny that the elite human capital position tends to be softer on crime. And I don't think that that's the correct position. I wrote some articles about Bukele and his success in El Salvador. I mean, I think the state of the American inner cities truly is disgraceful. And so, yeah, I mean, elite human capital, I think, is just averse to sort of force and averse to violence. And sometimes that can be good. Like, I don't think, they're going to, I don't think they're going to lock up and kill their enemies or anything like that. I mean, the white people who live in urban centers are the most, least violent demographic, anywhere. But but they have these sort of pie in the sky ideas about crime. And I don't think they've worked. I think, being tough on crime works for obvious reasons. There's just, an incentive issue. I don't think it's like inevitable that human capital is going to go towards defund the police stuff, because, a couple decades ago, New York City elected Mike Bloomberg and Rudy Giuliani, and they came down hard on crime. I think that this is not an issue. I think that the masses are probably always going to be more vindictive than elite human capital, who just, human instinct just sort of is tilted in the direction of vengeance. And to the degree to which elite human capital is sort of divorced from human nature, it can be reflective a little bit. It's going to be a little bit more understanding of criminals, unless you have some ideological reason not to be, which elite human capital sometimes does. I mean, communist states are often sometimes elite human capital comes to power and they're very tough on crime because they have this larger vision of like the way society should be. But yeah, I think elite human capital is at this point in history wrong on crime. But you can argue with them about it. I mean, have been like, even the defund the police stuff. I mean, they've gotten pretty far away from that. If you look at local elections in some places, Karen Bass in LA, who beat her opponent, who was more anti-crime, but she's gone a little bit more in the anti-crime direction. A lot of these cities like Philadelphia, we're about to, I think in California or LA County, we're about to vote out our district attorney, who's very soft on crime. He just survived a recall. And the San Francisco DA, what's his name? He was also recalled, wasn't he? I mean, didn't he lose an election, or he was recalled? So there are some corrective mechanisms within elite human capital, but yes, I tend to think they're too soft on crime.
So if we were just tallying, elite human capital, in your view, would you say they've been wrong on not just crime, but gender, race, maybe sometimes a little too much government intervention, regulation, or, market intervention in general, but they've been right on things like immigration and trade and reproductive rights? I guess what else would you add to the sort of tallying of what they've been wrong and right about?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if it's like that useful to just have a list of like EHC is correct on this and wrong on that. I mean, I can come up with 5 things that they're right on and 5 things that they're wrong on. I'm sort of interested in the analysis from the perspective of like what kind of people are inevitably going to rule, and like how can we influence them, and what is their relationship to the rest of society. So like even the market stuff is a little bit more complicated, because like when Kamala Harris starts talking about price controls, they, the media, the coverage in the media, you go to the Washington Post and it's very hostile. It's like all the experts say this is wrong. Something like YIMBYism, nothing in left-wing ideology. You say, oh, this is, right would maybe be more pro-housing, left is anti. Nothing in left-wing ideology would tell you to be a YIMBY. They're usually for restrictions and usually anti-market. But, you are getting these reforms in California and elsewhere, and YIMBY has sort of become the mainstream position in elite media. And so, yeah, I think even the stuff where they're wrong, I think there's a tendency towards correction. There are some things that they're sort of systematically wrong about. And, we have to think about all these things. We also have to think about what is the role of low human capital in society? What should they be doing rather than tweeting all day, tweeting fake news all day and getting millions of followers? How can we channel them in a different direction? Not give the censors, the disinformation experts all the power. We probably don't want to do that. But, sort of thinking about what does it mean that a lot of people are low human capital? I mean, I would prefer I've thought about this a little bit, probably prefer a kind of depoliticization. I mean, I look back, there's different historical eras. I look back to my childhood. I can remember the 1990s when regular people didn't get too excited about politics. And if you did, you were weird. And I think that's probably the best thing we can hope for.
Yeah. After Trump, do you envision sort of the tech right gaining power, like Elon types, JD, you've written about JD Vance and whether he represents sort of this tech right or this, status right. How do you think about how that could play out?
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. I mean, Elon is sort of in his own category. I mean, we talk about the tech right, but the fact that he owns Twitter, that's big. I mean, that's obviously a very big deal. And so it's going to be interesting. I mean, if Trump went, so either way, Elon Musk is going to be there. He's going to own these companies. And he's either going to be with a Trump administration trying to do all these things with influence, or fighting a Harris administration on all these things and having sort of Twitter in his pocket and being able to sort of mobilize the right against, anything that the government wants to do that is against his, his perceived interests. And so, yeah, I think almost the Elon question is more interesting. I don't know, the tech, no offense to any of the other guys, but, Thiel, made JD Vance. So that's obviously a big deal. And, almost got Blake Masters. that would have been the political miracle of a lifetime. And so that's obviously a big deal. But, to the extent that otherwise, these other guys, are they going to be major cultural figures, or are they just, because, a lot of them were DeSantis, Elon and Sachs were both DeSantis. In the end, the low human capital got their say. The college-educated Republicans did vote for DeSantis or Nikki Haley, and the non-college, which was a lot more of them, voted for, I don't know about Trump primary voters actually, but whatever. Trump got a lot more of the non-college educated voters, and they ended up, hitching to the Trump train, right? And so, the degree to which these guys are on the right now, but to the degree to which they can actually shape the right is yet to be seen. Now, maybe just Elon and Sachs can push they can push whoever they want once Trump is gone, because Trump is such a force that Elon and DeSantis and they all team up and they can't beat Trump. I mean, he just owns the right as long as he's there. And so what happens afterwards? Yeah, I don't know. They're going to be influential, on the margins. It'll move the, elites more towards pro-market positions. I think one good thing the tech right has done and the influence is, there was a sort of a more influence of these people, these kind of Catholic integralist types, these American compass types who are more pro, labor unions, more pro, sort of friendly to redistribution and the administrative state. There's still, these people are still around, but I think there's going to be less sympathy for that if the tech right guys are the major donors and they're sort of the cultural influence on the right. So I think on the margins, they'll move people. I think the more interesting question is is there, after Trump, do they get just more better human capital into the right? I mean, it hasn't happened immediately. I mean, Elon's retweeting Cat Turd and Libs of TikTok, and these are the people who've benefited most from the new order. But whether it sort of becomes, people see that, oh, you can be a smart person, you can do great things and be right wing. Does that change the culture? But that will take, a little bit more time.
Imagine if Trump, passed away in the next, if you right before 2028, let's say he either wins or doesn't win in 2024. And in 2028, sort of, there's a new slate and, JD Vance is running and Vivek is running, but also Nikki Haley is running and sort of, more neocon folks. I'm curious what you think happens then, but then also in terms of popularity, but also maybe let's go deeper on just JD Vance and what do you make of him from your analysis of him and his future impacts on the Republican Party?
Yeah, I mean, I think if Trump wins, to me, it's very hard to. I think whoever's the nominee in 2028 probably loses the Republican nominee because, like Trump, you can't imagine him being a popular president. He's going to be unpopular no matter what. And he's going to be very senile in 4 years, and that's going to make the party look really, really bad. And there's going to be one scandal after another. And so, and I think Democrats, like their bench of like the next person they're going to nominate is pretty strong. I mean, it's going to be someone like Newsom or Shapiro or Whitmer. It's going to be a moderate white person who in the case of Shapiro and Whitmer was a governor of a swing state, or Newsom, who I think has unusually high charisma and who comes across, all these people come across as moderate. They don't come across as crazy leftists. I think they're going to be very well positioned. So the unpopularity of Trump plus the fact that Democrats are probably going to have a very good candidate in 2028. I think, if I could put money down on the 2028 election, I'd put money on the Democrats, assuming Trump wins. If Kamala wins, then Republicans have more of a chance because she might be the unpopular president. And then, she's going to be running for re-election. And so, yeah, I mean, what happens in 2028, I think it's going to be interesting because these people will probably get behind Vance. I assume JD Vance is going to have his own. I think JD Vance. I mean, it's probably too early to talk like this, but like if it's a crowded field and Vance, it's usually the VP who was the last time usually gets it. And so if it's a crowded field and Vance has all these guys, he might not be popular in like the broad public. He might have an underwater approval rating, which he does right now, and that might not change in 4 years. But yeah, I think it's he's probably in a very good position. I didn't think this like a few weeks ago because it looked like Vance was a really bad pick. I mean, it looked like I still think he might be a bad pick, but like for a while, all anyone talked about was how weird he was and childless cat ladies. He's redeemed himself somewhat. I mean, he had a good debate performance. He seems very articulate compared to Trump. And so I think even if he's not that popular in the broad public, I think conservatives aren't under the impression that he's just, a horrible candidate who can't go anywhere. And so, yeah, he's very well positioned. And I mean, it'll be interesting. Vance is sort of like Trump in that he's singular and that he's like, very sort of, it's a very weird thing because I've written about Vance and he's got these tech guys, and I talked about how they're like a positive influence of like being keeping conservatives in a pro market direction. But you listen to Vance talk, and he doesn't talk like that. He talks like a kind of economic leftist sometimes. If you go to Congress, I mean, he votes against labor unions. He has like a perfectly poor rating. He ends up supporting. You might just say this is just sort of he's like a smarter Trump, and that he just talks like a populist, but then governs like a free marketer. Like maybe that's the end of being. It's like a smarter Trump, but like just more the strategy. But at the same time, I don't think Vance is not genuine, because that implies he's not genuine. And from knowing him and from seeing him, I think he's genuine. So it's sort of hard to know what to make of all that.
Yeah. So yeah, it's unclear whether he will represent sort of the rise of the tech right or just more of a statist.
Yeah. I mean, I think he'll somehow justify it. I think he's going to do the tech right stuff and somehow justify it in his mind. But, but I think JD is sort of a complicated guy. So who knows? He seems genuine. He seems to genuinely go out of his way to like say nice things about like Elizabeth Warren, which I don't think has like any political benefit. But like, if he's going to do stuff that makes Elizabeth Warren happy, God help us. We don't want that to be the future of the Republican Party.
Right. Talk about the differences between a Kamala presidency and a Trump presidency, in the next term. What are the counterfactuals, or what are the outcomes that are most likely to be different depending who wins?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I'll start with things that I think are probably more certain and less certain. I mean, your taxes will go up under Kamala just because the original Trump tax cuts are expiring, and so they'll have to negotiate something new, and probably the high earners like you, Erik, are probably going to have to pay a lot more, and maybe some of the rest of the public too. And so that we could see that. I mean, the sort of, you'll probably get, more deregulation under Trump. You'll get more conservative judges. If you like what conservative judges have been doing in recent years, you'll get more of that. If you don't like it, you'll get, less of that. And so there's that. I mean, on foreign policy, I think On Israel, you're probably going to see some kind of Middle East. You're going to see a sort of a continuation of the Biden presidency. I think with Trump, I mean, Trump is just a very, very pro-Israel. And I think the U.S. is just going to go all in on Israel like they did during Trump's first term. So that's going to be a major difference. The Ukraine thing is interesting because Trump is surrounded by hawks in his party. His instincts are to cut off Ukraine and not care about what happens to them. So which side sort of gets its way is going to be, I guess, a kind of an open question. I think that the Trump thing, if you want entertainment, if you just want to be entertained, I mean, something like 43 out of 46 of people he appointed, like for his cabinet, like are not supporting him this time or like actively opposed to him. And he noticed this and he's just going to appoint people who are just going to do what he wants. And this is going to create tension within the system because he's going to be increasingly senile, but increasingly sure like of himself and like what he's going to be doing in the government. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be sort of crazy. I mean, you remember the first Trump administration, it was one scandal after another. We're going to get, it's going to be more of that again. I think he probably has a historically bad midterm. First term presidents always have a bad midterm after being elected. He's going to be no exception to that. I mean, they did poorly in 2018 after Trump, and they've been doing poorly in midterm elections since Trump. So he's going to have a lot of sort of checks on his power, and his unpopularity is going to trickle down to the rest of the ticket. And so, yeah, I might write about this. He's going to be checked within the government. I don't think necessarily like some people say, oh, wokeness will pop back up. Like we'll go back to 2019, 2020 if Trump is elected again. I don't believe that. I think there's been a kind of burnout. I don't think that people can maintain sort of the level of frenzy we've had for I think that just burned out anyway. I mean, I think it burned out 2021, 2022, 2025, 2026. I think people are just going to sort of be over the Trump show. And he's got some kind of, this kind of like Joe Rogan / Theo Von sort of male influencer space where Trump is a little bit cool. I mean, he's not cool like, he's not like the young, like hip thing to be, but like in certain subcultures he is. So it's not like this clear thing where like everyone elite and everyone young and everyone cool is anti-Trump. Some of them are pro-Trump. And so like you don't have this sort of unified larger culture, this unified sort of youth culture and elite culture that is tilted against Trump. So I think either way, politics becomes a less central part of our lives. I think that that's probably a good thing and a reason to be optimistic.
Yeah, that for sure. I want to focus on foreign policy for a second. It's my understanding that John Mearsheimer believes that on Ukraine, Russia, we helped instigate and accelerate that conflict, more than it should have been. And if we had acted differently, a lot could have been prevented. And that also in the Israel sort of, October 7th, et cetera, that, I think he believes that we are almost compromised in our ability to get to sort of correctly ascertain what we should do, because I think he believes Jews have too much like power in the U.S. government or something, or foreign policy establishment or something. Or
I don't think he puts it like that, but you can.
Yeah. Okay. So how would you add in the characterization of his view, and how do you respond to it?
Yeah, I mean, I took a class with Mearsheimer back at the University of Chicago. I took a graduate course in great power politics, and I think some of his critiques of the policy in Ukraine are sensible. I mean, I've read or listened to interviews with people who were in the government, and they knew Putin was going to invade in early 2022, and they by all accounts they never took NATO off. Like, just try it. Just say NATO. NATO is off the table, right? Maybe Putin invades anyway, maybe, but it was worth a try, and they never tried it. They were connected. They were attached to this moral vision, like Putin has no right to tell Ukraine what kind of alliances it makes, which is right, which is morally correct. I think that a lot of people have discomfort with sort of Mearsheimer and a lot of these other people who are more anti-interventionist, is they think that they are too almost, if not rooting for the Russians, creating this kind of moral equivalence. Oh, U.S. wants Ukraine to be like a free country and decide. Russia wants to just dominate it forever. Well, it's interest. We each have our own sort of ideas. And I think most people are uncomfortable with that, and they don't think that's sort of a morally legitimate position to take in the world. And Mersheimer will do this thing where he will be like, I'm a realist, what does your morals have anything to do with it? But then he'll talk about, what Israel is doing to Gaza. And suddenly you realize, oh wait, this guy has like a moral sense too, right? He just has like, if something supports his sort of theories or vision of the way the world works, he'll use moralistic arguments. So like, I'm sure he would say that, what's happening in Gaza is a disgrace, and we've abetted something terrible over there. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there's legitimate point he makes about the run up to the war in Ukraine. I don't think that it necessarily follows that we do nothing now because there's a war going on and Ukraine is defending itself. And you can negotiate something, but I think Ukraine, it's always going to be negotiating from a certain position, and it can negotiate from a position of strength or it can negotiate from a position of weakness. And if the U.S. is not going to provide it with arms and it's not going to provide it with aid, no matter where the front line is, Ukraine will always be in a weaker position and it'll always have to give up more. So I think you have to negotiate, but ideally you would both negotiate and support Ukraine to the hilt. But people who want to negotiate often don't want to. They want to cut off Ukraine. They just want basically Ukraine to submit, to give up. That's the way. That's the easiest way to end the war. So I don't think that's acceptable. On the Israel thing, I'm just a very big believer in civilization over barbarism. I don't think the Gaza, I mean, is a society organized around. Israel left. They could have tried to build a real society. They either didn't want that, to a large extent they didn't want that, or they're under the control of Islamists who will create no opportunity for that. And Israel has to, in the end, defend itself. And it needs to work to remake Palestinian culture. And that doesn't mean they go in and run the schools or something. It means they just keep killing people until they do something different. And I think that's where the thing needs to go. You see the Biden administration, these Jake Sullivan and these types, and they're like, we need to work with these, the Israelis need to work with the Palestinians to have a political solution, a new government. And it's like, Hamas is there. You're fighting them. You're going to bring in a Palestinian from the West Bank or anywhere, and you're going to say, this is the government. They'll be killed the first day. There's literally nothing that you can do. There's nothing you can do. There's no political solution as long as Hamas is there, right? And so, yeah, I mean, Israel needs to keep fighting. The U.S. needs to keep supporting Israel. I mean, there came out a Wall Street Journal story about the killing of Yahya Sinwar, and basically he was citing American humanitarian pressure on Israel for the idea that the Palestinians should hold out, right? This is their strategy. Their strategy is to hide behind civilians, rely on sort of humanitarian impulse coming out from the West to try to pressure Israel. And that just creates bad incentives. That just makes sure the Islamists are always in power. They're always able to regroup for the next war. And eventually, they potentially, threaten Israel's existence. I don't think we could take Israel's existence indefinitely in the future for granted. I don't see Iran having much of an appetite for any kind of major escalation. They have these very sort of, managed strikes on Israel. They'll send all these missiles and one of them will hit or something, and they'll shoot all of them down, and then they'll send a message, through a third party to the U.S. saying, okay, that's enough. And so they seem to just be, doing enough to sort of try to save face as much as possible. And so whether Israel should strike, I don't know. You would have to I would need to know what information they have about the nuclear program and where, if Iran really wants a nuclear program or if they're going to go for it, and what if Israeli strikes can even stop that. I mean, that's very sort of, you need that specific information to make any kind of decision like that. But yeah, I think that what the Trump administration proved was you can build a broad coalition against Iran, right? The Sunni Arab states don't like Iran. They fear Iran. And between them and Israel, you could have a broad coalition. You could even make peace between the Israelis and many of the Arab states. And the one of the motivations behind October 7 was to head off any kind of Israeli-Saudi peace deal. And the people on the left might say, well, that's a good reason to give the Palestinians a state. I don't think a Palestinian state is possible. I have an article, why Palestine can't deliver peace. And so you have to sort of get the Palestinian situation under control. That's the best you can do, and hopefully try to make peace in the region based on mutual self-interest in this broad anti-Iran coalition.
You wrote a post about why Americans should support Ukraine. And my TLDR of the post is this idea that people need enemies. Enemies are what galvanize people and bring out the best in ourselves in terms of preparing for being our best. And if you're going to have enemies, you might as well make them autocratic dictators like Putin. How would you edit that characterization?
Yeah, that's right. The article was called "Why Americans Should Die for Ukraine," which is sort of, a little bit tongue in cheek, has a very funny AI generated image that I'm very proud of that people can go look at, which makes the entire article. Yeah, you look at like American history, and just reading a book. It's called The Conservative Futurist, and his name is James Pethokoukis. And basically, he talks about sort of these cycles and, this sort of cycles of American history, about how America was really optimistic about the future. That was like the 1950s and maybe early 1960s. By late 1960s, 1970s, we become very pessimistic. 1990s, we become optimistic again. And I was thinking about what is sort of the through line here. And I just realized that the first wave of optimism was because we won World War II. The second wave of optimism was because we won the Cold War. And if you don't have these things, sort of the memories kind of fade. And I think you can characterize sort of tribes in politics by who they make the enemy. So the left, it's the white, heterosexist male, blah, 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 patriarchy, all that. On the right, it really is just this kind of, anti-elite, just hating liberals or foreigners to a large extent. Trump and Vance, every problem is immigration or trade. And these I think are not healthy outlooks. I think they're just bad. I think they're just bad models of the world. I listed the political tribes, and they're all who their enemies are. And right, Trump is an enemy of the anti-Trump people, and Trump is the hero, and everyone against Trump in the deep state are the enemy in the pro-Trump tribe. And if you're going to have, if that's what we need, I think the best thing to do is give people an enemy who's actually deserves to be hated, that is actually evil, right? It's like Kim Jong-un, right? Putin, Xi Jinping, these are bad guys. It doesn't mean we go to war with all of them today. But if you're going to pick between the different enemies, I think that's that's at least a righteous cause. And to the extent that people have a desire to be part of history. History is being made in Ukraine, and when Ukraine is fighting Russia, I would say we take Israel's side. Some people would say, they're uncivilized, that we should take the Palestinian side. In the case of humanity, it's a longer conversation, but I think we should be on the pro-Israel side. And so, if you need that meaning, if you need that enemy, channel into that. Don't channel it into, I don't know, election workers in Atlanta who they just took Rudy Giuliani lost a kind of defamation suit, and he's giving them his Mercedes Benz, and he's giving them his condo, these just random black election workers from Atlanta. And it's this is what people are sort of into. It's just become so stupid and fundamentally unhealthy. So, to the extent that you need an enemy, yeah, I think foreign autocrats, play a great role. Like Iran, they're not that tough. They're very evil and hateable, but you can kill them and nothing happens, right? maybe that's a good enemy to have.
It's interesting. We have these sort of, natural instincts to outcast the other, blame the other, and maybe we've overcorrected too much on sort of going back to crime, where people are sort of elite human capital is probably afraid to call out sort of, black criminals because of our history around that in a way that leads us to sort of not solve the problem. But maybe you think we're the opposite on immigration, where we're too likely to call out people or, think negatively of people who come here legally or illegally. And I guess I'm curious what you think about in Europe. There are immigration challenges of, the Muslim population coming sort of in mass in certain places. Do you think they've overcorrected too much, like we've done with black criminals, or do you think they are sort of making the same mistakes that Americans are making when they're blaming, immigration for their problems?
Yeah, I think in the case of Europe, I think there's a more legitimate concern. So I did a big piece on immigrant crime, and immigrant crime is not a problem in the United States. It's actually lower, second generation of Hispanics, a little bit higher, but God, just worrying that a group is going to be 10% more criminal one generation in the future is not something the biggest, possible thing you should be worried about. You look at Europe, and you look at to this extent we have statistics on North Africans and Africans, sub-Saharan Africans, crime rate, it's 7, 8 times. It's just something it's just an incredible gap. And a lot of these Muslim populations, they're hostile to the broader population. Part of it is the European labor market, which I think doesn't do a good job of facilitating integration. And so Europe, I think, has different immigration challenges. I haven't been keeping up that much with it. It seems to me in the case of Germany, it seems to me like they've really actually like reduced immigration. It was the Merkel thing seems like it was like kind of like one time flood that seems to not have been continuing. Although I haven't looked too closely in the data, but a lot of these cases are like the French guest workers. They came in like a wave, and the Germans they had this Syrian and these Afghan refugees that came in this wave. And so, yeah, it produces other challenges. I think Europe has these changing demographics, and in the context of like just a very stagnant society, the Economist's latest issue is just very good on the strength of American economy compared to Europe. And you look at like the top companies in America, they're like Nvidia and Apple, and you look at Europe, and they're like Nestle and like Louis Vuitton. I mean, like two of the top five, and it's like this is not the future. Like these just chocolate and handbags. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the combination of changing demographics and just like a society that's sort of turned against progress. I mean, it's like not just like one policy. I mean, the German stuff is insane. I mean, they shut down their nuclear power at the exact same time. They lost the access of the gas to Russia, and their economy is actually supposed to shrink this year, right? Not even grow, 0.1%. It's gonna shrink. Well, Russia, by the way, is growing something like 4%. And so, yeah, this seems like a cultural rot. I mean, there seems just to be these forces that are just very, very anti-progress, and I don't know. I mean, it just might be a cultural problem at this point.
Speaking of demographics, you wrote about why East Asia has low fertility. Can you share your findings there, and does it portend anything for why we're having low fertility all over the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing about East Asians, I mean, they are, I think one thing that you can explain East Asians that I think covers a lot of ground and like actually just explains like tons and tons of data is that they are just outliers, human outliers on conformity. And in East Asia, I'm talking about Japan, Korea, China mainly. And what does that mean? Rock bottom crime rates, rock bottom drug use, right? Like I have all these charts of like different behaviors that are sort of proxies for risk taking. And then like, they're very smart, and they have like a lot of patents, and like these companies like Samsung and Sony and so forth. But like, as far as like overall rates of entrepreneurship, not very high. And these companies are just established corporations that people go to, and they work, they can do math and science, but they sit at these corporations for the rest of their lives and their entire careers. And so fertility, I think, is sort of like that. It's sort of interesting. I mean, Japan, you look at their TFR, they have just people who like babies produced to married couples. I think it's about like equal to the US. If you just count married, if you don't count like out of wedlock births, because they have 0 out of wedlock births, right? And the US is like 30 or 40% out of wedlock births. And that makes up the difference between them and us. Now, Korea is even lower. Korea, it's like 0.7. So like even if you just look at married, but these states have no out of wedlock births, at all. It's 1-2%. And so fertility is sort of a nonconformist thing to do. Like in America and the West, a lot of the people who have a lot of kids are nonconformists to society. They're these evangelical Christians, or they're these Catholic trads, or they're Elon Musk impregnating every woman who comes by him. Right? There's just some kind of like unusual kind of person or community, and so they don't have this. And this is why, like, I looked at some historical data, which is very interesting, which is that like these East Asian countries, they had the highest marriage rates and the highest rates of women living with a partner, in like the 1950s and 1960s, if you go back that far. And now they're like the lowest. And so what happened was, when the conformist thing was to get married and have a lot of kids, they tended to do that. And now when the sort of countercultural thing is to have a lot of kids, now they have rock bottom fertility. So I think Korean, East Asian conformity goes a long way to explaining things, because these are things that require, I say when there's not a script, like they tend to flounder. Like East Asians are very good at going to school and like graduating with a STEM degree and going work for a corporation. Not so good at necessarily, given level of education and intelligence, going off, just starting a company and doing their own thing. Although some people do that, obviously. And then it's the same thing with sort of, when there's a kind of like standard script of how you date and how you meet people, and like it's arranged marriage or it's very formalized. They will do that. When it's like find a partner and settle down and have kids, there seems to be a lot more trouble with that. And what that implies for the West, yeah, I don't know. I think they just, I don't know if it necessarily applies much for the West because we were so culturally distant. We're all sort of going in the same direction. We all have the same problems. They're just sort of an outlier. And like explaining why they're such an outlier, I thought was an interesting question, which is why I wrote about it.
And it relates to another post you wrote about, which is that goes by the title of "Do we need sports betting to get to Mars?" From which I took this idea of, if you want the benefits that come with high variance culture, you also have to, accept the negatives too. In order for people to think that they can be the next Elon Musk, they have to be able to, fall flat on their face and, get addicted to opioids or something. Or maybe in order to get Elon Musk, we need cat turd. Cool.
Yeah, I mean, Elon Musk and cat. You're right. I mean, they would shut down Elon Musk, and the sort of the safeties would shut down Elon Musk, and they would shut down cat turd. And do we want to remove both of their voices from the public square? That's the question. Yeah, I think this kind of high variance culture is what we have in America. Like we have like the most billionaires and the big corporations and the most murders and people. And some people will say this is ridiculous, you moron. Of course, you could ban sports betting and you could crack down on the murder rate, and you can still have like pro business policies that lead to economic growth. That's true. That sounds true. At the same time, there is just sort of a vibe of society. Like, do we as a society, are we the kind of people who get into other people's businesses and tell them to stop doing things that are bad for them or bad for even for society? Or do we just say, go for it? Do we have a default for freedom? And like maybe ideally we'd get things like perfectly correct, but that's hard to do, right? It's just society is sort of governed by vibes. And so if we have to pick vibes, like maybe it's not a coincidence that we have all these terrible outcomes, but all these great outcomes at the same time.
Same with wokeness, that's it too, right? Trans or excessive sort of, first principles thinking on gender or race, is also what it maybe enables first principle thinking.
And if you look at like the anti-wokeness, wokeness takes over the world. You listen to the anti-wokes in Europe, they're using the exact same memes from, Fox News and Trump. Right. And, so it's like, yeah, we have all the variants. We have this thing and we have the resistance to this, big thing that's taking over the world. This third world socialists, and, they're kidding. They're getting their ideas from the West. And so are, Bukele and, Castro is getting ideas from the West. Not Castro's dead, but, Latin American leftists. And then Bukele and like Milei is, reading Ludwig von Mises and these radical libertarians and like influencing his policy. So yeah, we're the fount of like all the, basically everything. I don't want to say everything important happened in the world, but a lot that's important is happening in the world.
Maybe closing on this idea of elite human capital, I'm curious where you differ with Burnham in this, who also had this idea of sort of, an oligarchy or technocracy. You wrote a blog post titled "Why Burnham is Wrong About Everything." So
yeah, well, why Burnham? Did I write why Burnham was wrong? I was maybe a little bit too tough. Maybe that was too punchy of a headline. I don't remember the exact title. That sounds like something I could have written, but I'm not sure. Yeah, I do remember the article though. Yeah, Burnham is not a thinker who focuses much on psychology or like differences between individuals. There's systems in Burnham. There's the businessman, there is the elite, there's the managerial elite, and they're sort of struggling for power in these class struggles. It's sort of a Marxist kind of philosophy like that, where humans are sort of treated interchangeably. My worldview is like heavy on human psychology and heavy on sort of differences between groups and sort of the norms and the culture that they develop, right? And so Burnham, I think that like this river versus village or this tech right versus establishment kind of thing that we're seeing, it really doesn't fit into that, because Burnham would have predicted by now, 2024, my God, the New Dealers or their descendants had totally crushed the private opposition. And we don't see that. We see Elon Musk, one man can buy Twitter and totally change the conversation, right? So I think that there's Burnham predictions, which I think he didn't necessarily get right, and then there's I think the lack of sort of psychology in his theories that are a weakness.
Yeah. Is there anything we haven't covered that you think is important to get into as we're just going over some of the main ideas that you've had in the past few months?
Not really. I mean, everything that pops into my head, you'll find it on Twitter, or you'll find it on Substack. Yeah, we're going to have an election soon. I'm very excited. It's fun. I have no idea. I never had an election where I had such little idea of what was going to happen. I would not be surprised if Trump won by 5. I wouldn't be surprised if Kamala won by 5. I'd be a little bit more surprised if Kamala won by 5, but I wouldn't be that shocked. We had the polls radically underestimating Trump the 2 times he ran, but we had the polls underestimating Democrats since the Dobbs decision. So but now we have it's like these 2 principles. They're one has to be right and wrong. Is it the Dobbs? Is it the sort of the realignment that's going to make these high propensity voters come out? Will the low propensity voters that like Trump, will they come out, or will the Trump tsunami come in? And the polls show them exactly tied in pretty much every swing state, and there are reasons it can go in either direction. So I just want everyone to know that I'm very excited. I enjoy myself. I enjoy watching this stuff. I don't have as much sort of emotional investment as a lot of people do, and other people, to the extent you can, just sort of enjoy the show.
Well, on that note, are you worried about the Biden judges as it affects of civil rights laws, wealth taxes, regulatory power, death penalty? A mutual friend of ours said maybe you're underrating the potential harm or potential risk of enabling these judges.
Oh no, I think it's bad policies. I mean, I've written about the kind of bad policies that will. I think some of our friends think that Democrats are going to lock them all up or something like that. I think that they tend to be hysterical. But just getting the anti-growth policies, do I worry about them shutting down free speech? I feel pretty secure with Substack and with Elon owning Twitter. I feel pretty secure on that. There'll be certain cases, maybe the White House pressures this or that. I don't think they're going to implement some kind of, reign of terror on us. But yeah, I think a lot of I think they're going to have bad anti-growth policies, and that's a negative and a reason to be, hesitant about supporting Democrats, of course.
Is it fair to say that basically, Elon Musk thinks that Kamala winning is sort of the end of civilization, and Noah Smith thinks Trump winning, risks the end of our democracy, that yours kind of it won't be that bad either way, basically?
Yeah, I mean, one election is not, it's unlikely. I mean, everyone thinks that in an election year. I think that they're right. I think the Noah Smith types are right about Trump's intentions. They're as bad as can possibly be. But I think that things will mostly hold, and he's too, the common reasons he's too stupid and scatterbrained to follow through on all that much, and it's going to get he's declining over time. He's declining right before our eyes. I don't even understand sort of the Elon Musk. This will be the last. I sort of think that's just hype and election year propaganda. This will be the last election ever. They're going to legalize all the immigrants, and then within one election cycle, there will be so many of them, there will be no swing states left. This is what Elon says, right? And yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to even understand. They're not, first of all, they're not going to legalize all the immigrants. You need Congress. The Republicans are going to have the Senate. And so she can't unilaterally legalize everyone. They take some while to get registered and involved in politics once they are legalized. And so, Hispanics often vote, we'll see what Trump gets, but they sometimes vote Republican. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the threat of the left is something like Europe. I don't think it's reign of terror. I don't think it's Stalin or Pol Pot. I think it's the sort of anti-growth, neurotic interest group, labor unions, public sector controlled society. And that's a bad enough outcome. I mean, I think that that's something that's worth fighting to avoid.
You don't buy the sort of argument some people make that at age of 78, Trump has, undergone a lot of spiritual growth and, is just a more magnanimous and high integrity person than he used to be. I'm just kidding.
You just listen to him. Yeah, you could really see that. It is, talking about Arnold Palmer's junk and all that stuff. Yeah, he seems seems to have matured a lot.
Well, on that note, so the next time we chat, we will have a new president in office, and we'll talk about what that means. Richard, thanks so much for coming to the podcast. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, Erik.
Hey everyone, Erik here. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from our AI and investing cluster of podcasts to shows that drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, investors, and influencers, like Econ 102 with Noah Smith. We're launching new shows every week, and we're looking for industry-leading sponsors. If you think that might be you and your company, email me at eric@turpentine.co. That's ERIK @turpentine.co, and let's partner together.